Those words sent a surge of anger through me. Tell me what? That you stole my identity? That you opened credit cards in my name and ruined my credit? My voice cracked, but I didn't care. He ran a hand through his hair, his shoulders slumping. I didn't think it would get this far, he said. I needed help, and I didn't know how to ask. Help? I snapped. So you decided to steal from me instead? It wasn't like that, he said quickly. I thought I could handle it. I was going to pay it back. Pay it back? You've maxed out 5 cards. I yelled, the volume of my voice surprising even me. Do you have any idea what this has done to my credit? My future? I can't even apply for a car loan now, Dad. He flinched at my words, but didn't respond immediately. After a long pause, he said, I didn't have a choice. Things got tight. Your mom doesn't know how bad it's been. I was drowning, and I couldn't see another way out. I stared at him, incredulous. So, instead of asking for help, you decided to drag me down with you? Do you have any idea how betrayed I feel right now? His face crumpled, and for a moment, I thought I saw regret. I know I messed up, he said softly. I didn't think it would get this far. I thought I'd fix it before you even noticed. I shook my head, unable to believe what I was hearing. You didn't even try to tell me. You didn't give me a chance to say no, or to help you. You just took. I'm sorry, he said, but the words felt hollow. Before I could respond, my mom came into the garage, her face full of concern. What's going on? She asked, looking between us. I turned to her, my voice shaking with frustration. Did you know about this? Did you know he's been opening credit cards in my name? Her eyes widened in shock. What? No, of course not. That's ridiculous. It's true, I said, pointing to the papers on the workbench. He's racked up thousands of dollars in debt under my name. She turned to my dad, her face a mixture of confusion and disbelief. Is this true? He nodded, unable to meet her eyes. I didn't mean for it to get this bad, he said. I was just trying to get us through a rough patch. My mom looked at me, then back at him, her expression hardening. How could you do this to her? To your own child? I wanted to feel vindicated, but instead, I felt exhausted. The confrontation had only scratched the surface of what needed to be addressed, and I knew this was far from over. I'll fix it, my dad said, his voice barely audible. You'd better, I replied, turning to leave. Because if you don't, I will. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had broken between us. My dad had always been my rock, my guide, my example of what it meant to be a good person. Now, I wasn't sure I'd ever see him the same way again. When I returned to my parents' house the next day, I knew the confrontation wasn't over. My dad had promised to fix it, but I needed more than vague assurances. I needed answers and accountability. He was sitting at the kitchen table when I arrived, staring at a cup of coffee that had probably gone cold. He didn't look up as I walked in, but I could see the tension in his posture. My mom hovered nearby, clearly unsure whether to stay or leave. We need to talk, I said, placing a fresh stack of documents on the table. They were copies of the accounts, interest rates, and my rapidly tanking credit score, evidence of the mess he'd created. He finally met my eyes, and I could see the guilt etched into his face. I know, he said quietly. I've been thinking about what I did, and I want to explain. The explanation was worse than I expected. I was drowning in bills, he began, his voice heavy. Your mom doesn't know how bad things have gotten. Between the mortgage, the car payments, and the medical expenses, he trailed off, shaking his head. I didn't know what else to do. So, you decided to steal from me? I shot back, my voice sharp. Without even asking? It wasn't like that, he insisted. I thought it was temporary. I thought I could pay it off before you noticed. Temporary? 5 cards, Dad. Thousands of dollars. Late payments on every single one. That's not temporary. That's a disaster. I pointed to the papers in front of him. Do you even understand what you've done to my credit? My future. He flinched at the anger in my voice, but didn't apologize. Instead, he tried to justify it. I didn't want to burden you, he said. You were just starting your career, and I didn't want to ask for money outright. This was the only way I could keep things afloat. I stared at him, incredulous. So instead of burdening me with the truth, you burdened me with this? I gestured to the mountain of debt. You've put me in a worse position than I would have been in if you'd just asked for help. But what really stung was what he said next. I'm your father, he said, his voice tinged with frustration. I've done so much for you over the years. I thought you'd understand. I felt like the wind had been knocked out of me. Understand? I repeated, my voice shaking. You want me to understand why you stole my identity and wrecked my credit? You've ruined my ability to get a loan, to buy a car, to even rent an apartment if I need to. And you're asking me to understand? He looked away, as though he couldn't face the weight of my words. I didn't think it would go this far, he said, almost to himself. That's not an excuse, I snapped. Do you know how hard I've worked to build a stable life? To make sure I never had to rely on anyone? You've taken all of that away from me. And for what? So you could avoid having an honest conversation? My mom, who had been silently watching from the corner of the room, finally spoke up. He was just trying to keep us afloat, she said, her voice pleading. We've been under so much stress, and he didn't want to burden you. Stop calling it a burden, I said, turning to her. You're acting like I should be grateful he didn't ask me for help, like this was a noble thing to do. It wasn't. It was selfish. My dad's face hardened, and I could see his frustration bubbling to the surface. You don't understand how hard it's been, he said, his voice rising. I did what I had to do for this family. Everything I've ever done has been for you and your siblings. That doesn't justify what you've done, I said, standing my ground. You didn't just take money. You took my trust. You took my future. And now you're trying to guilt me into forgiving you. He didn't respond. And for a moment, the room was silent except for the ticking of the kitchen clock. You've crossed the line, Dad, I said finally, my voice steady but firm. And I don't know how you expect me to just move past it. He sighed and leaned back in his chair, looking defeated. I'll fix it, he said again, but the words fell hollow. How? I asked. Because, right now, all I see is a mess that you don't even know how to clean up. I'll find a way, he said, but I wasn't sure I believed him. As I left the house that day, I realized something important. My dad wasn't just trying to explain himself. He was trying to justify what he'd done. And no amount of justification could undo the damage he'd caused. After the confrontation with my dad, I needed to talk to someone who wasn't directly involved, someone who might help me process the betrayal and figure out what to do next. I called my cousin Michelle, who had always been the level-headed one in the family. When I told her everything, how my dad had opened credit cards in my name, racked up debt, and ruined my credit, her initial reaction was disbelief. Are you serious? She asked. Uncle Joe did that? I can't even wrap my head around it. She listened as I vented, offering the kind of support I desperately needed. You're not crazy for being upset, she said. And you're not wrong to want to protect yourself. He crossed the line? I felt a little better after our conversation, but I underestimated just how quickly word would spread. By the next day, it seemed like the entire family knew, and their reactions were far from what I expected. It started with a phone call that I almost didn't answer. The number on the screen was from a bank I didn't recognize, and I was in the middle of making dinner. When it went to voicemail, I figured it was another scam call or telemarketer. But when I finally listened, the message hit me like a punch to the gut. This is a courtesy call regarding the missed payment on your credit card account ending in 8421. Please call us back to resolve this matter. Missed payment? Credit card? I didn't even recognize the last 4 digits. I'd only ever had one credit card, and I was meticulous about paying it off in full every month. My first thought was that it had to be a mistake. Maybe someone had input the wrong phone number, or the bank had confused my account with someone else's. But curiosity and a growing sense of dread got the better of me. I called the number back, hoping to clear things up quickly. Instead, what I heard on the other end of the line made my stomach drop. The representative pulled up the account and confirmed the details. It was under my name, my address, and even my social security number. It was unquestionably tied to my identity. Can you tell me when this account was opened? I asked, gripping the phone tightly. March of last year, the rep replied. March? That didn't make any sense. I didn't open a new credit card in March or any time last year. There's got to be some mistake, I said. I didn't open this account. Do you want to dispute the charges? The rep asked, her tone patient but professional. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. Yes, absolutely. Please send me the account details. When the email arrived a few minutes later, I opened it on my laptop and began scanning through the transactions. That's when I noticed something odd. The purchases weren't just random. They were eerily familiar. Gas station charges near my parents' house. Online orders from hardware stores my dad frequented. Restaurant bills from places he loved. It hit me like a freight train. My dad. I stared at the screen in disbelief. No, it couldn't be. My dad was the most responsible person I knew. He was the one who taught me about the importance of good credit, of paying bills on time, of living within your means. But as I scrolled through the charges, the evidence was undeniable. There were too many coincidences. Payments had been made from his bank account. The timeline lined up perfectly with times he had mentioned unexpected expenses but never explained. I sat there for what felt like hours, trying to process what this meant. My own father had opened a credit card in my name, without my permission, and racked up thousands of dollars in charges. Anger, betrayal, and confusion swirled in my chest. How could he do this to me? How long had this been going on? And, most importantly, why? I closed my laptop and leaned back in my chair, the weight of the discovery pressing down on me. I didn't know what my next move would be, but one thing was clear. This wasn't a mistake. My dad had crossed a line, and there was no going back. At first, I clung to denial. My dad? The same man who preached about honesty, integrity, and hard work? He was the one who taught me how to budget my first paycheck and warned me about the dangers of credit card debt. It had to be a mistake. Maybe someone had stolen his identity and used mine as a cover. Maybe there was some explanation that didn't involve him knowingly doing this to me. But the more I looked, the harder it became to deny the truth. I started combing through my credit report, something I hadn't done in months. As I went line by line, the picture got even uglier. There wasn't just one card under my name. There were five. 5 accounts, all opened within the past 2 years, all maxed out to their limits. The total debt was staggering, well into 5 figures. My heart pounded as I realized how much damage had been done, not just to my finances, but to my future. Worse, there were late payments on nearly every account, which meant my credit score had tanked. What if I needed a loan? What if I wanted to buy a house someday? My dad's actions were jeopardizing all of that. It was like watching a train wreck in slow motion. The transactions told a story, one I couldn't ignore. Gas stations near my parents' house. Online orders from a hardware store my dad swore by. Restaurant bills from his favorite spots, the same ones he always bragged about finding great deals at. He hadn't even tried to hide it. The payments were made from his bank account, directly tied to his personal checking. It wasn't just careless, it was brazen. I started piecing together the timeline. The first account had been opened shortly after I got my first full-time job. I'd celebrated with my parents, telling them how excited I was to finally have financial independence. Apparently, my dad saw that as an opportunity. Over the next 2 years, he'd opened account after account, steadily maxing them out. He made minimum payments here and there to keep the banks from calling too soon, but eventually, the weight of the debt caught up to him. That's when the calls started coming to me. The more I uncovered, the angrier I became. I thought about all the times he'd casually mentioned being stressed about money or joked about needing a side hustle. At the time, I'd laughed it off, thinking it was just dad humor. Now I realized those moments had been hints, breadcrumbs leading to this mess. I felt a wave of betrayal unlike anything I'd ever experienced. This wasn't just a mistake or a momentary lapse in judgment. My dad had made a deliberate decision, over and over again, to use my name for his own financial gain. And in doing so, he jeopardized my future without a second thought. But why? That was the question I kept coming back to. Why would he do this to me, his own child? Was he really that desperate? Or did he think I'd never find out? Sitting at my kitchen table, surrounded by printed statements and a credit report that looked like a disaster zone, I felt a mix of emotions I couldn't even name. Part of me wanted to confront him immediately, to demand answers. But another part of me hesitated. This was my dad, the man who had been my rock growing up, the person I trusted more than anyone. How could he have done this? One thing was certain, I couldn't ignore it. Whatever his reasons, whatever the fallout, I needed answers. Because this wasn't just about money, it was about trust. And my dad had shattered mine. The drive to my parents' house felt endless, even though it was only 20 minutes away. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly they hurt, and my stomach churned with a mix of anger and nerves. I couldn't wrap my head around it. How could the man who raised me, who always seemed to have the answers, have done something so reckless, so cruel? When I pulled into the driveway, my mom's car was there, and I hesitated for a moment. Should I do this with her around? Would she even believe me? But I couldn't wait. The printed bank statements and credit reports sat on the passenger seat like evidence in a trial, and I knew I had to face him now. Inside, my mom was in the living room, flipping through channels like it was any other day. "Oh, hi, sweetie," she said, smiling when she saw me. "You're here early. Where's Dad?" I asked, ignoring her cheerful tone. She frowned, sensing something was off. "In the garage, I think. Is everything okay?" I didn't answer, heading straight for the door that led to the garage. My dad was bent over his workbench, tinkering with something I couldn't see. When I stepped into the garage, he glanced up, his face breaking into a smile, until he saw the papers in my hand. "Dad, we need to talk," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. He straightened, his eyes flicking to the stack of papers. "What's this about?" he asked, though the hesitation in his voice told me he already knew. I thrust the papers toward him, watching as he took them reluctantly. His face went pale as he scanned the first page, and for a moment I thought he might deny it. But then he sighed, placing the papers on the workbench with a defeated expression. "I was going to tell you," he said quietly. Instead of sympathy, I was met with accusations and guilt trips. My aunt called me, her voice laced with disbelief. "You're going to report your own father?" she asked, as though I had suggested something unthinkable. "I don't have a choice," I replied. "He used my name to open multiple accounts. My credit is ruined. If I don't report it, I'll be held responsible for all that debt." "But he's your father," she said, her tone scolding. "He made a mistake. Are you really going to destroy his reputation over this?" It was like she didn't hear a word I said. "He destroyed my reputation first," I shot back. "Do you know what happens when lenders see multiple maxed-out credit cards and late payments tied to my name? I'm the one dealing with the consequences, not him." My mom was even worse. She cornered me during a family dinner, whispering harshly so no one else would hear. "You're going to ruin him," she said, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and desperation. "Do you know what people will say if this becomes public? What about what they'll say about me?" I replied, my voice low but firm. "I didn't do anything wrong, but I'm the one suffering. How is that fair?" She didn't have an answer, just a long, disappointed sigh that cut me to the core. Even my siblings weren't on my side. My older brother, always the peacekeeper, pulled me aside one afternoon to lecture me about family loyalty. "You should have handled this privately," he said, shaking his head. "Do you know what this could do to Dad if people find out? His reputation, his business, it'll be ruined." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "What about my reputation?" I snapped. "Or my ability to get a loan? Or rent an apartment? Does any of that matter to you?" "You're being selfish," he said bluntly. "You made a mistake. You don't need to blow it out of proportion." "Selfish?" I repeated, my voice rising. "Do you even hear yourself? He stole from me. He used my identity to rack up thousands of dollars in debt, and I'm the selfish one for wanting to fix it." My younger sister, the only one who seemed somewhat sympathetic, still tried to talk me out of taking action. "I get that you're mad," she said. "I would be too. But is it worth tearing the family apart over this?" I looked at her, incredulous. "I'm not the one tearing us apart," I said. "Dad did that the moment he decided to steal from me. No one seemed to care about what this was doing to me. The focus was entirely on my dad, his reputation, his feelings, his future. It was as though my suffering was an acceptable price to pay as long as it spared him embarrassment. I began to feel isolated, like I was fighting a battle no one else could see. Every conversation with my family left me drained and second-guessing myself. Was I overreacting? Should I just let it go? But then I'd look at the evidence, the credit reports, the mounting debt the hit my credit score had taken, and I knew I couldn't. This wasn't just about money. It was about trust, about boundaries, and about standing up for myself. If my dad could do this and face no consequences, what message would that send? That it was okay to take advantage of me because I was family? That I didn't deserve protection because it might inconvenience someone else? I didn't know how this would end, but one thing was clear. I wasn't going to let my dad, or anyone else, convince me that what he did was okay. The guilt trips from my family were relentless, but I knew deep down that I couldn't let their opinions sway me. My dad's actions had left me with thousands of dollars in debt and a damaged credit score, and I was the one who had to live with the consequences. If I didn't take action, no one else would. The first step was filing a police report to document the fraud. Walking into the station felt like crossing an invisible line I could never uncross. This wasn't just a family issue anymore. It was a legal matter. The officer at the desk asked me to explain what had happened, and as I told the story, I felt a strange mix of shame and anger. "Did you confront the person who did this?" the officer asked, typing notes into his computer. "Yes," I said. "It's my dad." He paused, looking up at me with raised eyebrows. "Your father?" "Yes," I said again, my voice firmer this time. "He used my identity to open multiple credit cards without my permission." The officer didn't judge, at least not outwardly. He nodded and asked for documentation, which I handed over in a folder. Copies of the credit reports, statements from the fraudulent accounts, and evidence linking the transactions to my dad. Once the report was filed, I moved on to the next step, contacting the credit card companies. Each call was a grueling process, with long hold times and endless explanations. "Thank you for holding," one representative finally said. "Can you confirm that you're disputing these charges as unauthorized?" "Yes," I replied, my patience wearing thin. "I didn't open these accounts or make any of the purchases." The representative asked for more details, and I went through the same story I'd already told a dozen times. They needed proof that I hadn't authorized the accounts, which meant providing everything from a copy of the police report to notarized affidavits. If the charges stand, you'll be responsible for repayment, the rep warned. I understand, I said, though the thought of being held accountable for debt I didn't create made my stomach churn. After hanging up, I stared at the growing stack of paperwork on my desk. It felt surreal, like I was trapped in a nightmare where I had to fight to prove my innocence for something I hadn't done. The most painful part was realizing how much damage had already been done. My credit score had plummeted because of the late payments, and even if I managed to clear the fraudulent accounts, it could take years to fully recover. I called a credit counselor to ask for advice, and they explained the process in grim detail. Unfortunately, clearing your name can be a long and frustrating journey, they said. But you're doing the right thing by addressing it head-on. Their reassurance helped a little, but every call, every form, and every email was a reminder of the mess my dad had created. I couldn't escape it. Not at work, not at home, not even when I tried to sleep. Even so, I refused to back down. I wasn't just fighting for my financial future. I was fighting for my sense of self. My dad's actions had shaken my confidence and trust, but this was my way of taking back control. For the first time in weeks, I felt a small glimmer of hope. The road ahead was daunting, but at least I was moving forward. And no matter what my family said, I knew I was doing the right thing. If I thought filing the police report was hard, the aftermath was worse. My mom called me the same evening, her voice trembling with tears. "How could you do this?" she asked, the words hitting me like a slap. "Mom, he committed fraud," I said, gripping the phone tightly. "This isn't just some misunderstanding. He stole my identity and put me in debt. I can't just ignore that." "But the police?" she cried. "Your dad could go to jail. Is that what you want? Do you want to ruin his life?" "I didn't ruin his life," I replied, my voice firm despite the lump in my throat. "He did this to himself. I'm just trying to get my life back." She didn't seem to hear me. "You're supposed to protect your family," she said, "not betray them. How can you turn on your own father like this?" The guilt she heaped on me was overwhelming, but it didn't stop there. Word spread quickly through the family, and soon I was getting calls from aunts, uncles, and cousins, all with the same refrain. "How could you do this?" "You're overreacting," my Aunt Linda said when she called. "It's just money. He was probably going to pay it back eventually. Why involve the police?" "It's not just money," I said, my frustration boiling over. "It's my credit, my name, my future. He's put me in a position where I might not be able to buy a house or get a loan for years. Do you understand how serious this is?" "It's family," she countered, as though that erased the consequences. "Sometimes you have to let things go for the sake of keeping the peace." Keeping the peace. That seemed to be everyone's priority, except mine. Even my siblings weren't on my side. My older brother, Mark, called me selfish for involving the authorities. "You could have handled this privately," he said, his tone dripping with disapproval. "I tried," I shot back. But Dad wasn't taking responsibility. He just kept saying he'd fix it without offering any real solutions. I couldn't wait around while my credit was destroyed. "You don't understand what this could do to him," Mark argued. "His reputation, his job, it could all be ruined. Do you want that on your conscience?" "What about my reputation?" I asked, my voice rising. "Or my ability to live my life without being saddled with debt I didn't create? Does that matter at all to you?" He didn't have an answer, but his silence spoke volumes. My younger sister, Sarah, tried to play mediator. "I get why you're upset," she said. "But is this really worth tearing the family apart?" "Tearing the family apart?" I repeated, incredulous. "I'm not the one who tore us apart. Dad did that the moment he decided to steal from me." She looked down, unable to meet my eyes. "I just think there has to be another way," she murmured. The pressure from my family was relentless. At every turn, they framed me as the villain, the ungrateful child who was willing to destroy her father's life over a mistake. "You're putting money over family," my mom said during yet another tearful phone call. "How can you be so heartless? Do you even hear yourself?" I asked, my voice shaking. "He's the one who put money over family when he stole from me. Why is it my job to protect him when he didn't think twice about hurting me?" But no matter how clearly I explained my side, no one seemed to care about what this was doing to me. They only saw my dad as the victim, and me as the ungrateful daughter who was ruining everything. The guilt was crushing at times, but I knew I couldn't let it sway me. My dad had crossed a line, and pretending otherwise wouldn't fix anything. Every time I felt doubt creeping in, I reminded myself of the facts. The debt, the damaged credit, the endless calls from creditors demanding payment. This wasn't something I could sweep under the rug. It was my life on the line, and I had every right to fight for it. The backlash from my family hurt, but I refused to let them bully me into silence. If protecting myself meant being the villain in their eyes, so be it. I wasn't going to let their opinions stop me from doing what was right. It didn't take long for the investigation to catch up with my dad. The police report I filed triggered a formal inquiry, and the mounting evidence against him was impossible to ignore. Bank records, credit card statements, and his own payments tied directly to the fraudulent accounts painted a clear picture of his guilt. Eventually, he was forced to admit what he had done. There was no way to talk his way out of it, not when the truth was so glaringly obvious. To avoid more severe legal consequences, he entered into an agreement to repay part of the debt. While he managed to avoid jail time, the process left him financially drained and humiliated. His reputation in the community took a massive hit. People who once admired him for his work ethic and integrity now whispered about the betrayal he'd inflicted on his own family. He avoided social gatherings, neighbors stopped waving when they saw him outside, and even his business relationships began to suffer. I thought his confession might bring some resolution, but it only made things worse with my family. My mom, who had been teetering between denial and anger since the beginning, finally snapped. "You didn't have to take it this far," she said one evening when I visited. Her words came out sharp, as if she had been holding them back for weeks. "We could have fixed this as a family." I stared at her, dumbfounded. How? By sweeping it under the rug? By pretending it didn't happen? That wouldn't have fixed anything. She shook her head, her face etched with disappointment. "You didn't even give us a chance. You went straight to the police, and now look at what's happened. Your father's reputation is ruined. Our lives will never be the same." I felt a surge of anger rise in my chest. "What about my life, Mom? Do you know how hard it's been to clean up this mess? My credit is still wrecked. I've spent hours on the phone with creditors, filling out forms and disputing charges. I've had to fight to prove my own innocence for something I didn't do. And you're worried about his reputation?" Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't back down. "You're his daughter," she said quietly. "Family is supposed to protect each other." That seemed to be the refrain from everyone in the family. No matter how much evidence I presented, no matter how clearly I explained the impact his actions had on my life, they still saw me as the villain. My aunt called to berate me again, this time about the humiliation my dad was facing. "You've made this so much worse than it needed to be," she said. "Do you even care about what this is doing to him?" I wanted to scream. "He stole from me," I said, my voice shaking. "He put me in thousands of dollars of debt, and I'm the one who's paying for it. Literally. How is this my fault?" "It's not about fault," she replied. "It's about forgiveness. Families don't do this to each other. Families also don't steal from each other," I shot back. "But I guess that part doesn't matter to you." Even my siblings continued to pile on the guilt. My brother accused me of kicking Dad when he was down, while my sister begged me to drop the issue entirely. "He's already repaying the debt," she said. "What more do you want?" I didn't know how to make them understand that it wasn't just about the money. It was about trust that had been shattered in a way I wasn't sure could ever be repaired. No matter what I said, it felt like I was talking to a brick wall. My family refused to see the situation from my perspective. To them, my dad was a victim of his own mistakes, someone who deserved sympathy and forgiveness. But to me, he was the person who had betrayed me in one of the worst ways imaginable. He had taken my name, my credit, and my future, all without a second thought. And now I was the one being punished for standing up for myself. The isolation was suffocating, but I refused to back down. I had fought too hard to clean up the mess my dad had created, and I wasn't going to let anyone guilt me into staying silent. At the end of the day, I knew I had done the right thing, even if no one else could see it. Once the legal issues were behind me, I thought I'd feel a sense of relief, but the reality of the damage lingered like a shadow over everything. My credit report, riddled with late payments and high balances, looked like a war zone. Even though the fraudulent accounts were officially labeled as disputes, some of the marks couldn't be removed entirely. My credit score, once a source of pride, was now something I dreaded checking. The first step in rebuilding was opening a secured credit card. It felt like starting from scratch, putting down a deposit just to prove I could be trusted with my own finances. Every purchase I made on that card felt like a tiny step toward reclaiming what I'd lost. I paid off the balance in full every month, watching as my score inched up point by painstaking point. The process was frustratingly slow. Every loan application I submitted was met with higher interest rates, or worse, outright rejections. The financial independence I'd worked so hard to build felt like a distant memory. But through it all, I reminded myself that this was temporary. The mess my dad had created wouldn't define me forever. What saved me during this time was my friends. They became my lifeline, offering support and perspective when my family's guilt trips became too much to bear. My best friend, Maria, was particularly relentless in reminding me that standing up for myself wasn't selfish. "You're doing what you have to do," she said one night over coffee. "Your dad made his choices, and now he has to face the consequences. That doesn't make you the bad guy." "But my family doesn't see it that way," I said, stirring my mug absent-mindedly. "They think I betrayed him." "They're wrong," Maria said firmly. "They're just upset because you didn't let this slide. But if the roles were reversed, would anyone have let you get away with it?" Her words stayed with me. My family's loyalty to my dad was blinding them to the reality of what he'd done. But I couldn't afford to let their opinions dictate my actions. It took months of hard work and determination, but eventually I began to feel like I had control over my life again. My credit scores slowly improved, and the secured credit card gave way to a regular one. I even managed to secure a small personal loan, which I used strategically to demonstrate responsible repayment. Each milestone felt like a victory, a reminder that I was capable of rebuilding what had been taken from me. The financial damage my dad had caused was significant, but it wasn't insurmountable. Despite my progress, my relationship with my dad remained fractured. We didn't speak, not because I hated him, but because I didn't know how to face him after everything. The betrayal was still too fresh, and the wounds hadn't fully healed. I saw him occasionally at family gatherings, but our interactions were brief and strained. He would offer polite greetings, and I would respond in kind, but neither of us addressed the elephant in the room. As much as I wanted to rebuild my credit, I also wanted to rebuild my trust in him, in my family, and in myself. But trust, I realized, was harder to repair than a credit score. It required honesty, accountability, and time. And right now, I wasn't sure my dad was ready to give me any of those things. For now, I focused on what I could control: my own life, my own future. I wasn't where I wanted to be yet, but I was getting there. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. Looking back, I can see now that my dad's betrayal wasn't just about the money or the ruined credit. It was about the boundaries he crossed and the trust he shattered. For so long, I believed that family meant unconditional loyalty, that the people who love you would always have your best interests at heart. My dad's actions forced me to question those beliefs and redefine what family really means. His betrayal taught me a harsh but valuable lesson. Love doesn't give anyone the right to take advantage of you. Boundaries exist for a reason, even within families. Just because someone shares your blood doesn't mean they're entitled to your trust or to your identity. It was a painful realization, but it helped me grow. For the first time, I understood that protecting myself wasn't selfish. It was necessary. If I hadn't stood up to my dad, if I had let his actions slide for the sake of keeping the peace, the damage would have been even greater. Family isn't about blind loyalty. It's about respect and accountability. My dad broke that trust, and while I'll always love him, I've accepted that I may never see him the same way again. The man who once felt like my biggest supporter, my rock, now feels like a stranger in some ways. But that doesn't mean I hate him. Over time, I've come to understand that his actions, while deeply hurtful, came from his own struggles and desperation. That doesn't excuse what he did, but it helps me make peace with it. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means letting go of the anger so it doesn't consume me. Even so, I've learned to be more cautious. My dad's actions left scars, but they also made me stronger. Today, I'm more intentional about who I trust and how I protect myself, even with the people closest to me. Rebuilding my life hasn't been easy, but it's been worth it. My credit is slowly improving, and with each milestone, I feel more in control of my future. I've learned to celebrate the small victories, qualifying for a better credit card, seeing my score inch higher, and finally being able to consider new financial opportunities. Through it all, I found strength I didn't know I had. My dad's betrayal knocked me down, but it didn't break me. It showed me that I'm capable of standing up for myself, even when the odds feel stacked against me. If there's one thing I've taken away from this experience, it's that self-respect matters more than keeping the peace. No one, not even family, has the right to take advantage of you or make you feel small. The scars from this ordeal will always be there, but they're a reminder of how far I've come. I've learned to protect myself, to value my own worth, and to trust my instincts. No one will ever take advantage of me like that again, and for that, I'm stronger than I've ever been.